Okay, welcome everybody to our Meet the Humans in Digital Humanities panel, where we're just gonna kind of demystify and talk about some of the projects we've worked on as the people behind the projects. I have with me 4 wonderful panelists. I'm gonna let them introduce themselves.
Hello, I'm Victoria, or Vic Jones. I'm the archivist here at Mississippi University for Women. I've been at the W for about 1.5 years, and I've been in this position for about 8 months now. And I'm excited to get started in working in digital humanities and being able to connect that with archives and history. Thank you for having me.
I am Dhanashree Thorat, Assistant Professor of English at Mississippi State, just down the road from MUW. Excited to be here. I really wanted to get that cat filter that the cat lawyer had the other day, but I couldn't quite figure that out. But happy to be here, and I'm sharing the stage, so to say, with one of our fantastic grad students. So I'll let Katie introduce herself.
Yeah, I'm Katie Starliper. I'm a grad student at Mississippi State in getting my master's in English. And I actually didn't know about digital humanities until about 1 year ago when I took Dr. Thorat's class. So I'm really excited to share just what I've learned from a student perspective in that regard.
Hi everyone, I'm Nickoal Eichmann-Kalwara. I'm a digital scholarship librarian at University of Colorado Boulder. I'm also a director for our Center for Research Data and Digital Scholarship, and I teach our core course for our Digital Humanities Graduate Certificate Program. Thank you so much for having me. Mississippi, especially Mississippi State University, is what gave me my start in librarianship, so I appreciate being here.
And I'm Hillary Richardson. I'm the coordinator of undergraduate research in information literacy at MUW. And I teach 2 classes in the digital studies minor, Intro to Digital Research, and the digital research final project. So I'm glad to have you all here. I'm glad to be a part of this panel. I'm looking forward to some really interesting conversation. So without any further delay, let's go ahead and start that conversation. I'm going to open up the floor to giving you guys a chance to talk about the anatomies of your projects, and we'll let whoever wants to go first. We have a very polite group of panelists, so.
I have a barky dog, so if you don't mind me going later instead, I hope that's okay. Sorry, I intended to go first.
Katie and Dr. Thorat, would you guys like to go first?
Sure. I think we may have had a slide here. Is there something about the DH class on here?
Is it?
Or it might have been for a later. That's okay. I can start off.
Do you want to share your screen?
No, that's fine. That's fine. I can talk through it. I think the slide that I put in may have been later then.
Okay.
So I taught an introduction to digital humanities class last spring, and we started the semester off before the pandemic, and then midway through it, of course, everything shifted online. And one of the really interesting things that that particular class worked on was, how do you get into a DH project? So the question here, of course, is anatomy of a project. And we talked about, how to prepare, what kinds of community-oriented ethics did we need to develop. And my class came up with brainstormed and came up with these really interesting principles that I can share in one of the later questions. So for anatomy of a DH project, I would say, before you even get into the project, you have to really consider and plan for the communities you're responsible for and how you're going to work with the different stakeholders for the project and the ethics of the project. And Katie was part of this group. So, and Katie also worked on a COVID diary, some data visualizations. So Katie, feel free to jump in.
Yeah, Towards the end of the semester, we sort of shifted all our attentions towards COVID because it was kind of a perfect opportunity to apply a lot of what we'd been talking about. And one of the things we as a class came together, I think most of us did at least, was talking about if we wanted to archive the local area experiences of COVID, what sort of ethics we needed to look at in terms of deciding how to include things. Like, do we solicit it from people? Do we let them submit it on their own? What sort of access do people have to it? What would we limit what we would allow to be included? Those sort of things. Including like if people share things on social media, like asking the question, do we reach out to those people to ask for permission, or do we just take it because it's been shared publicly? Like, how do we reconcile those sorts of problems?
Do you guys want to take a minute and just say briefly what the purpose of your project in your class was?
Yeah, so the class was an introduction to DH, and we basically covered a number of key kind of broad areas in DH. So we talked about digital archiving, data visualization, literary text analysis, and then the entire class was kind of undergirded by the scholarship coming out of Transform DH, FOCO DH, and really kind of taking a critical perspective towards these different areas in DH. And for the project that Katie just mentioned, there were, as you all have probably seen, as soon as the pandemic kind of hit America, there were a lot of these new projects coming up about collecting experiences of an ongoing crisis. And there were conversations about, what we need to remember for future generations and what we can collect. There's a lot of social media content. And so part of what the class did, we did not quite get to collecting material, but we talked about, what we would, the structure, the framework for what we would need to do in order to collect material. And the Mississippi State Libraries was quite interested in the project, and it was taken up by them. I'm not quite sure how much further it's gone, but the class was kind of brainstorming, how to prepare for this project, the ethics of it, how do you ask people to submit material when, they might be grieving or they might be sick? And so what are the ethics of collecting material related to an ongoing crisis? And that's what the class mainly kind of brainstormed and talked about.
Yeah, and we also talked about it, especially in the context of erasure, like what some of the projects we had looked at in the class up till that point were about histories that had been erased, and like how do you bring those voices to the light, and then also who does that archiving? Because if you have a board of all white people, for example, and you're trying to bring Black voices to light, like how does that reflect? Like they're not being represented on the panel of people putting the information together. So how does that work? So we talked about all that stuff in the context of having looked at all of these other DH projects that were specifically focused on that kind of activism.
I'd be happy to go next if that's all right.
Go for it.
Yeah, I think that's everything that Katie and Dr. Thorat had just talked about really reflects the project that I'm talking about today. So let me share my screen if that's all right. So this project is something that came out of my fall 2019 Digital Humanities course. It's a graduate course that is, again, the core course for our DH grad certificate program. The course was made up around 15 students, and only a few are from the humanities. The vast majority are in adjacent fields like media studies or communications, rhetoric. And we also had information science folks and a couple of computer science people too. So it's mostly social science-y in a way. But anyhow, we created this project we ended up calling it Digital El Diario. It is based on an independent newspaper that was published at our university in the 70s and 80s as part of the Chicano student movement. So digital El Diario is about taking El Diario de la Gente, the newspaper, and creating a data set from it and rehumanizing that data as part of the process, and thinking about all the concerns that had already been brought up, thinking about agency and also thinking about archival recovery, especially archival justice in this case. This project, I started thinking about it back in the spring of 2019 as this newspaper had just been digitized by the Colorado Historic Newspaper Collections. So this is what it looks like here. And basically, in addition to creating a set of rules, or rather guidelines, for how we're going to approach this project as ethically as possible, not being from this time, we created that sort of document. But we also, we went through this database and we went through each issue, and we basically just copied and pasted individual articles and screenshotted various images or artworks that were of interest to us, and tried to create a plain text corpus, essentially. And so to me, this is an example of a set of micro digital humanities projects. So we had 5 different groups in the class who took this data set and eventually analyzed it using a variety of DH techniques. So our goal, however, is not just to explore DH through this corpus, but our goal was to have a form of archival justice because of the history of the Chicano student movement on our campus. Even today, there are the same issues and same topics, and we're still fighting for better resources for ethnic studies and for our Chicano students and recognition. So these archives had actually been distributed in Colorado, and the newspaper itself was distributed, and then it was sort of collected in this digital database, and then we were able to transform it in this sense. So we have all these different readings. One group of students looks at the news cycle related to six different Chicano activists who were bombed. There were 2 car bombings in Colorado. So they looked at the news coverage between 2 different newspapers, El Diario, as well as another one. And we also had some topic modeling, which is a text mining technique that looks at co-occurrences of words, and you as a human apply what you think those categories ought to be, and sort of macroscopically reading all those texts. We also had folks look at just the poetry and the artwork, and which is really rich in this newspaper. We also had some natural language processing experiments, and we had some mapping experiments of trying to connect the lands rights struggles that were discussed in the 70s and how they connect to today. So basically, our project is this one big site, or it's not really that big, with these micro analyses, if you will. And we have our data that is available publicly, but it still needs work. There's a lot of digital care work still required for it. So our goal is to, this is where our data lives. We're going to put this on probably GitHub because it made sense to put on Open Science Framework at the time. But so it's like the anatomy of the DH project is these tools, this website, creating the corpus, thinking about it ethically, and rehumanizing it as part of the process for these types of analyses. I'll stop there.
So the project I worked on was kind of a fun cross, I think, between like more of a typical library and information science project and a digital humanities project. Helly, would you like me to share, or would you like to share again? I don't have a preference.
You go.
Okay. And so in order to do this, I have them actually behind me, the Journal of Mississippi History, and using sort of a bibliometric study combined with a content analysis, I wanted to see what is being published in the Journal of Mississippi History. And what I did was, this is a video of, not me, but one of my student workers, as scanning, I didn't have like PDF copies or like text copies of the journals. So I scanned them using our Book Eye scanner here at the Beulah-Culbertson Archives and Special Collections, and was able to get PDF and text files of the journals. And then from there, ended up getting it sort of in this text file that I was able to use. And so this arrow I'm now realizing is backwards, but this article is from one of the journals, and this is what it looks like if you were to pull up the Journal of Mississippi History as a PDF or to open it, like get a hard copy. And then I scanned all of these that weren't available online, which were most of them, because I think they only have like the last 5 years available. And I scanned them, got them as a text file, and was able to use that to do a content analysis and study what is being published in the Journal of Mississippi History from the overall time span was like 1939 to 2019. And this here is a like named entity recognition. So from using the Gale Digital Scholars Lab. So I got to see what types of terms were really occurring and in what categories. I'm going to touch more on like how I had to continuously sort of fail and refail and fail again in another question. So you'll see that this isn't a perfectly clean data set, but it's a good example of how this sort of started versus where I ended up at. And then the second image is a sentiment analysis tool that Digital Scholars Lab also allows you to use. And I did that. I looked at, I also used topic modeling, like it was used in the LDRIO project, and obviously slightly different, but it helped me sort of see and understand what were the types of subjects that were being published most frequently in the Journal of Mississippi History, and what people are reading and learning and writing and researching about about Mississippi history. And so it was really interesting for me. I think I learned quite a lot. A lot of it was very Civil War based, and a lot of it was political history. And it was just fascinating to sort of see how that had changed or remained the same over this really broad time period. So from 1939 to 2019. And I used that for my MLIS capstone project. And I was just really interested as a historian and as an archivist to see what people are publishing about Mississippi state history. There was only one previous study that had been done, and it was a shorter time period. It only looked at about a decade, and it didn't do as much of a content analysis as what I did. And so it was just, I think, fascinating to see that and have like the data to see what was being done, and not just, you can read all of the journals and you can read all of the issues and kind of get an idea, but to have that backed up with numbers and data and text was really fun for me.
I'm so glad to be going next, because I feel like what I'm about to talk about kind of builds on your 3 projects. So I'm gonna pull this back up. That's all right. So the project that I worked on actually with Nickoal, who's on the panel, starting in 2015, I believe, is called the Starkville Civil Rights Project. It was conceived as a way to tell a story that most people know as the integration of the University of Mississippi, which was very violent, which was very fraught. It was very publicized. But the Starkville integration and the Starkville civil rights struggles that were going on in the town, conversely, were not super publicized. The stories that the people in Starkville had were not widely told. So this was conceived as a way to kind of talk about a history that wasn't really predominant. It was a way to, take what was a dominant narrative and try to talk about it in a different way. And so the things that are involved in this project, I'm going to share with you here. So this is the Starkville Civil Rights Project website. I think the heartbeat of this website is really the section called The People, which is around 20, I think, interviews of people who in some way witnessed or experienced some kind of struggle with integration or desegregation or Mississippi State issues or even the public school district. So to get to this point, I think Dhanashree and Katie mentioned talking about collecting experiences of an ongoing crisis. Even though this is not technically ongoing, I'm sure somebody will argue with me about that. This is not technically ongoing because it happened in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. It felt still very real, and giving these interviews a video really does make that happen and feel less ongoing and more present. And in order to get to this point, we had to learn a lot of things. I like that we're also talking about learning a lot of things, because to get to this point, we decided we could not transcribe a whole hour long or whole hour and a half long interview and get this project done. We had to do what was called indexing, where you transcribe part of an interview, give it a synopsis, keywords, and subjects, and have it sort of show all of the chapters of the interviews. So everybody who was interviewed, we spent a long time re-listening to all of the things they had to say, taking notes, partially transcribing and uploading into the system called the Oral History Metadata Synchronizer, or OHMS for short. We also had to learn how to use recording equipment properly. We had to learn how to use audio recorders, video recorders, lighting, scenery adjustments, and minor editing tools. Of course, we didn't edit these a whole lot. We wanted to keep the integrity of their words, but we did want to have, you know, a nice opening screen, so you weren't just immediately starting in the middle of an interview. Another section of this website is the place. The place is part of this project because it centers around the town of Starkville, and we wanted to give people who came across the site context on what kind of a place it was, in terms of the geography, in terms of the demographics, and in terms of the history. So that's what this does. And in addition to that, we have a map here that actually is, let's see if I can find it, is a little preview of like the segregated or previously segregated, or the, I guess, historical consequences of segregation on the town of Starkville, and it shows you like the segregated movie theaters and the schools and things like that. And in order to get to this, we had to do a lot of research on the town. All of these images were part of our place narrative. We had to also make a lot of notes about what we wanted, and that's what you see here, our back end notes on that site. And part of the place also is the timeline of what it had to go through as compared to the rest of the nation. And so we made a timeline as well. It has a nice, well, when it loads, it has a nice narrative that kind of shows, okay, this was when Brown versus Board of Education was passed and was, you know, ordered. But then we have this whole timeline after of when schools were desegregating, and when people were marching and protesting. And the way we got to this was to compile all of this research and all of this data and all these images to put into a spreadsheet that eventually formed the back end of that timeline. So it looks like this nice thing, but the back end of it is this large, very large spreadsheet. The last part of the website is the narrative part of the website. And this is the part of the project that was more typical of like a research project. But it was the most difficult part, I think, for us, because we had to learn how to work as a group to write basically these miniature essays that tied all of the research we had done prior to into several narratives. Using the interviews, clips from the interviews, using some of the map images and data, and, you know, putting all that together. And there were lots of ethical considerations that we had to take into consideration when posting some of these things. I think because of the nature of their content. But all of this was a collaborative effort by students, grad students, and faculty to do kind of miniature research projects. And the way that we had to do this was, let me go back to the, yes, was to, whoops, brainstorm for a long time on ways that we wanted to structure things. We had to write and rewrite and revise. We had to have a lot of snacks and caffeine and group meetings. And we were not in a class. We were not in any sort of established group. These were all just free time meetings that we had. But it was really rewarding to see what you can see on this whiteboard to go up onto a website. And in doing so, we eventually came up with these sites on our WordPress site, which, to be honest, was a feat in itself because a lot of us were not familiar with WordPress at the time. So that was also part of learning how to do this. And so with that, I'll go to our next question. Sorry, Vic, I'm going back over your things. Here we go. What does it mean to engage with your community digitally? Do you guys want to go first again, Dhanashree and Katie, since I think this was more central to your project?
Yeah, and I just saw, if you could go to the next slide, I just saw what I was going to talk about. So this was actually an interview with Jessica Marie Johnson that we began our class with. And one of the things that Dr. Johnson talks about in this interview is actually community accountability. And I love that first line of this paragraph where she says, I think the humanities has a justice imperative. And the question that we took up in the very kind of early first 3 weeks of our class was, you know, what does that mean for us? Most of us, I think, in that class were Mississippi people. It was actually my first year in Mississippi. And there are all of these terrible perceptions about Mississippi nationally. We are considered to be backwards in everything, or in racial politics in particular. And yet we have these really rich legacies of activism, for example, in the state. So one of the things we took up in our class was, you know, if we are to create digital stories or to do digital storytelling about Mississippi, what kinds of stories should we tell? And how really should we approach telling these stories? Who was our audience, and what were the narratives that we were perhaps working against, if this is kind of the perception of Mississippi nationally? And I will say we actually looked at the Starkville Civil Rights Project. That was one of the projects that the class looked at, and we talked about, you know, what that project was doing and how we could build on these existing projects. And so that actually gave us an interesting model to look at. And on the next slide, I've actually shared some of these community accountability guidelines that the class came up with. So the first question was, you know, who are we and who are we accountable to? And everybody had very interesting responses. We also realized we were accountable to different communities, and actually having that kind of intersecting, overlapping set of a mesh of communities was very interesting. And then what are best practices or ethics for community accountability? And I want to share this first one in particular, where students actually created these on their own in the classroom working together. And one of them was, you know, DH allows for the creation of shared and accessible spaces. And so all of the work we wanted to do was based on this kind of notion that we wanted to be accessible, we wanted to create projects critically, right? That you can't just kind of take digital technology because it's available. What can we do with it? How can we create transformative projects with digital technology? And that was kind of the core of the digital humanities class. And I will say this was not in the DH class, but my other class, the semester prior, was a composition class. And again, my class had looked at the Starkville Civil Rights Project. And those undergrads actually took up campus buildings, and we told stories about campus buildings. The students were freshmen. They were very interested in exploring, what the campus around them. And they came up with these really interesting bits of archival research about like chicken sacrifices in one of our buildings, or the history of racism with some of the people that the buildings were named after. So that kind of community-based, local, community-based storytelling was very interesting in all the classes that I've kind of taught here, which took up DH in some way. And Katie's project, I think the COVID diary, that might be an interesting bit to talk about here, Katie, because that was also about, how you live locally during COVID in Starkville. So I'll push the ball to Katie here.
Yeah, that was I ended up doing it all digitally the whole time, like writing it in a Word document, because I felt that the format allowed me to incorporate things, because I was really interested in reporting the statistics every day and those kinds of things. And as I went through it, it was a reflection of like who would be reading this, and what sort of community do I want to reflect, because I started off only ever looking at the Johns Hopkins global issues. And then as it went on and we got more data about COVID, I started to focus in on Mississippi's representation and how it changed and those sorts of things. So I almost sort of thought about the diary in a meta way, because I was thinking about not only using it for myself, but also knowing I wanted it to be in an archive, and then trying not to write it for that purpose. So being willing to stay open and honest about all of it and not actively editing it as I went. And it kind of gave me a really interesting perspective on how things get represented in archives and whether or not they're edited for the archive. So like being aware of how you're representing the community from a really weird sort of, again, metatextual experience.
I'll pop in next, I guess, if that's all right. I don't have a slide to share. I would just say that we've had the exact same issues with Digital El Diario. And even more so, I think that there is some harm reduction that has to come from that. I'm trying to avoid white saviorism, for instance, and especially leveraging my position. I'm trying to leverage my position to create opportunities within the community. And by the community, I mean CU Boulder, I mean the Denver metropolitan area, the Chicano community itself, and really digital humanities folks who are interested in this archival justice type of work. So for us, the next piece of what we mean by working with the community digitally is to do some more descriptive work, for lack of better terms, of describing and categorizing the data that we do have, but working with community members, because there are still so many activists and people who wrote in the newspaper. In fact, the founder of this newspaper had recently contacted me, and our hope is to incorporate those voices with the students who are working on this project. So in other words, it is a collaborative process, and it absolutely should be and needs to be, and it can't be happening in a vacuum. And with this project, that's especially important because of the harm that has already been done by a predominantly white institutional administration towards the Chicano community around here. So we're very sensitive to that, and Yeah, that's basically what it means for us right now.
The community base for my project was, I'd say, a lot different in that, or maybe not a lot different, but I was most interested in, I guess, engaging with other historians, authors, political scientists, people who are reading and wanting to publish in the Journal of Mississippi History. And one thing that was really big for me is sort of like access, and that there are copies of, like, especially the most recent issues available and accessible online, but the older issues of the journal, like most journals, are either behind a paywall or you have to have access to an academic library in order to sort of see what was previously published, which I thankfully have because I work at the W, but of course not everyone does. And so using that as the basis of my content analysis was really, and then with the goal, the ultimate goal, to make that accessible and available to a large body of people, in order to talk about what is being talked about by Mississippi historians, I think is really interesting, and especially in moving the community forward, and like as we're continuing to do history, and to see what has been previously talked about, but also what the journal has been consistently publishing. Like, if there is there like, are there specific topics that they're only publishing on? Are there specific topics that they seem to be avoiding? And so if authors of that type of history in Mississippi are trying to publish in the journal, that may or may not be a really good call. And so I was really interested in getting that information and then sharing that information with this admittedly a bit small, but I think clearly not doing small things based on everyone else's research, community. And so, yeah, that was really sort of the goal of mine. I guess in the actual research that I was done, I wasn't engaging digitally because it's all print copies. It's all previously published. And then I guess one thing I actually did find is that I keep saying small, but it's really not that small. I actually looked into who was publishing and who and where people were publishing from. And so, of course, the majority of authors in the journal are from Mississippi, but there's also people from throughout the Southeast, and there were contributors from Australia, Spain, Turkey, the United Kingdom. So I think that although it's locally focused on Mississippi history, it does clearly have a global impact. So I just wanted to sort of engage with that, maybe not initially digitally, but hopefully making that accessible to people globally, like the journal.
I will answer this by going back to, I love the idea of community being an ongoing thing. And one of the things that we did with the Starkville Civil Rights Project was to talk about community as a living thing. And the website was supposed to reflect that as also being a living thing and an ongoing project. And so in order to engage with the community with whom we were interviewing, and to show and to share those stories, we had several what we called community forums, so that we could share the stories that we found, but also how we were learning about what everybody was saying. So we had a few community forums where we talked about, this is one of the latest ones, we talked about, excuse me while I scroll, some of the things we learned about the history of Starkville as it compared to the history of other integration and desegregation movements in the state. And we had a few participants who actually recorded an interview after coming to this. So a couple of the interviews on the site were people who came to this and said, I have a story too. And interviews kept coming, by word of mouth from other people who had interviewed. So our community grew a little bit as we interacted with people in the town. We had another community forum specifically with teachers who wanted to teach these things in their classrooms. So this second community forum that we had discussed ways to integrate the voices of the people on the website and in the town with curriculum objectives. And so we had people who were from the MDE, what was it, Curriculum Standards Board. We had people who had written textbooks, and we had teachers themselves talk about how they had used the site as well. So our kind of community engagement was very direct because we wanted people to use, the reason that we created the site was so that people could use it and build on it. We very much thought of it as a community site. And so our next question is, how does digital humanities embrace learning by doing or failing forward?
We can take this question and start us off if you'd like, Hillary.
Sounds good.
So as I'm speaking kind of mostly in the context of my class, I will say I really emphasize to students that we are not interested in products, and we're not interested, in what they can accomplish as a finished thing. Because in the duration of a short semester, there's really only so much you can do. So we have dedicated lab days, and Hillary, if you could go to the next slide, I've just posted some of the tools that we take up. So we have dedicated lab days which get put on the syllabus when students just come in and with their laptops, or I can bring a laptop, and we play with different DH tools. So Story Map, Voyant, things that we can easily get set up with in just that one class period. And we see what we can do with it. And lab days, I think, are not quite a common model in the humanities. It's more of a sciencey thing, but I think it's a good way to encourage students to just see what's possible with a tool. And sometimes students do become interested in a tool and end up using it for their final project. But even on the final project, one thing that I always emphasize is, it's okay to work on it slowly. I don't need a polished, finished product. And in the past, this has led to students actually coming up with really interesting documents or interesting projects which are in progress. So in a previous version of this class, which I taught at the University of Kansas, a student actually created technical documentation for a project that he had been working on for a long time. And he was going to hand the project over at some point. And so we sat down and said, what works for you? What do you need to get out of this? What do you need to share with the people who will come after you? And so he started creating technical documentation. Another student took up Omeka and created a digital exhibit about a lodge and a lodge, I think, in California, and WPA art. And they were never finished projects, and there were always little things that did not quite work well, right? The metadata might have been very imperfect, or you click on a link and something breaks like 2 weeks after you've put it together. And so failure was kind of written into the project guidelines. And I always tell my students, keep a backup copy in Word if you have to. If everything fails, we will have something to go back to, and that's totally fine as well if the project does not come together the way you want it. And I think it does encourage students. It's very hard to tell students it's okay to fail, I think, because they're told so often in other classes that you have to have finished products by a deadline. It's very hard to kind of work against that instinct, but it's something that I do try to encourage, that it's okay to not have finished products in a DH class. We can keep working on it afterwards if they are interested.
Vic, did you have something to add?
Yes, I think I had a lot of failure, but two really big run-ins, I guess. The first one was, I'm not quite sure if I should call it a failure or if my professor kept me from running into a bigger failure and sort of managing the work. So this project was done in the space of a semester because it was done for my capstone research. And so I really had this big idea. I wanted to look at every single issue of every single journal that was published since 1939. And my professor was like, you need to scale this back because that is a failure waiting to happen in the span of about 4 to 6 weeks. And so I ended up, that first one was deciding to do a systematic sampling. I didn't look at every single issue of every single journal. I looked at, I think, like every 4th or 5th year in order to get a sampling of the time period. And then, but the constant failure that I ran into was when I especially was working in the digital scholar lab and trying to clean my data so that I would have this nice, gorgeous finished product that is my topic modeling and my graphs. And I mentioned earlier that the one I showed was not perfect. It was one of my midpoints, but I think in all for like just one of the tools that I used on one day had like 18 different runs of trying to get this data to look correctly. I messaged Hillary in a panic, like, what am I doing wrong? And of course, Hillary was super helpful, but I had to learn that this was part of the process and sort of like running a tool, seeing what happened, making edits to the data, doing some more cleaning, making sure I had a good corpus to work with, and then running it again and then making edits based on what I was trying to get out of it. And then even then it was never, I would say never as perfect as my perfectionist heart ever wanted it to be. But I ultimately, I did finish the project and I'm proud of it. And so just learning that every failure was unsuccessful and yet successful, and that I learned how to make the next run a little bit less of a failure and a little bit more closer to that final product. So that in itself was a process.
Nickoal, did you want to say anything about failing forward?
Yeah, I agree with everything that has already been mentioned, that creating prototypes is a great way to think about failing forward, that it doesn't have to be a perfect product in the end, that learning by doing, you're definitely exposed to a lot of different things that way. I guess the thing that I would add is that working with data is messy. And digital humanities is about, often, not always, about creating data and, as I've mentioned, rehumanizing that data. And I think that's the messy piece that is tricky, and we can fail forward in that way, and socially, technically, a lot of different ways. And yeah, I mean, our data for digital El Diario is still incredibly messy. There's so many optical character recognition or OCR issues still. We have some encoding issues because of people working between Macs and PCs, and so unsuspected errors that we didn't plan for. So there's a lot of digital care work that we need to do, but the benefit of doing that digital care work means that it's an opportunity to have these closer readings of the sources again on a more granular level that we didn't have before. So enriching our own knowledge of the process as we datafy things again.
I would also agree, definitely agree with everything everybody has said. The process for me is just as important, if not more so, than the product, the cool graphic at the end. That data is messy, that you have to try again and be flexible. And I guess the thing that I would add is the thing that keeps me together throughout the whole process and grounded in a way is documentation, and documenting the steps that you take through that process and saying, okay, let's write down what didn't work. Let's write down what did. Let's also write down what we're going to try to do next so that we can keep going. And, and Vic will tell you, because we're working on a project together now, which we'll talk about in a second, that we have documentation in all forms and shapes and sizes about things that we are just, having to assume along the way. Like, we're not really sure if this is right, but we're going to write it down, because if it's not, we can come back and see where we made a choice. So I think documenting what we're doing is part of our failing forward process as well.
If I could just say something before we move, I'm also interested in how, like, sometimes failure is not about you failing, but maybe the technology failing you. And I think that's something we don't talk about enough in DH, or perhaps we do, because I have two stories. So one was actually, I did a project as a grad student. I forget which platform I used, but I created the project while I was in the US, and then I had to go to India over the break, and the project would not load in India over the kind of Wi-Fi connection I was using, because it had become such a big, massive project. And I had to email my grad instructor at that point and say, hey, I can't finish this thing because it's literally not loading for me. And that was a limitation of the tool, a failure of the tool rather than a failure on my part. The other instance was actually a grad student at KU when I was teaching my DH class. And Shane Lynch, he works on indigenous mapping, and he was telling a story about indigenous histories, but Google Maps does not recognize indigenous nation borders, right? So how do you tell a story about something when your platform itself does not recognize the legitimacy of that kind of knowledge pathway? And so sometimes I feel like failure is not about us, but rather it's the tool which was not intended to do what you wanted to do. And I suspect this comes down to a cis heteropatriarchy, to white supremacy, to the way these ideologies get coded into our tools, to issues of access in the global south. But failure in that context is not about us at all. And I think that's kind of the other thing I would add.
Excellent. Thank you for reminding us about that. And yeah, I would agree. We'll take, I guess, if anybody has any questions, go ahead and put them in the chat. The last thing that we wanted to just mention was that this is our sort of, I think people are doing what we would call digital humanities on the campus of MUW. So this question is not a comprehensively answered one. But Vic and I are working on building opportunities for digital humanities on campus with this collection of letters that she and I are working on together now, called the, I will say informally called the Smith Family Papers. Vic, is it okay if I go ahead and play this?
Yes.
Okay, so we have a donation of about 6,000 letters, which we are digitizing and creating metadata for, and trying to do projects with them, including a network analysis. Maybe one day we'll do a map of where the letters were going and where they came from. But there are a lot of opportunities for historical, rhetorical, literary analysis, I think, of these letters and their contents. And their metadata contents. And so what we're doing right now is to try to make that accessible through transcripts of the letters, and what you see in the spreadsheet below are the metadata that will eventually put the letters into the institutional repository, but also give the letters themselves more to work with. So you can see the letter over here, the scan of it. You can see the transcript happening and the tags that we're giving the transcript. And you can see the metadata here that will eventually bring it up into the IR. And I think that this will be a lot of opportunity. I hope this will be a lot of opportunity for people to do kind of what Nickoal was saying earlier. She said, explore DH through a corpus. And if this is our corpus, I think people can explore DH, but I think people can also explore this corpus through DH methods, which is something I'm experimenting in the Intro to Digital Research class right now. Vic, did you want to add anything?
No, I think you did a really good job of explaining that. I think this has been a really great process for me personally. I've enjoyed it a lot. And I also enjoy working with students on this. I'm continuously, I don't know why I'm always not surprised, but like I love getting student feedback sometimes because they're new, especially working with undergraduates. Their perspective on things make me completely like step back and want to like reconsider how something's done. So that's been fun getting to pop into Hillary's classes. And then just learning this process as we go through it has been really fascinating. So
we do have a question in the chat from Samantha. She says, you all brought up the point of collective memory. I think this is so important for DH. How does DH allow for previously considered opinions on subjects or texts to be reconstructed? What opportunity does that reconsideration provide for how we negotiate public memory? Would anybody like to address this? I should say, would anybody like to address this first?
I can try. So we've got a number of things come to mind. I think collective memory and this idea of public memory is so interesting because I think DH really does give us different tools to do public memory work and to work with communities in terms of how they want to remember community life. And I was thinking about this. We just recently got funding for a mini project on the Starkville Black Lives Matter March. Jeremy Montgomery, who's a history grad student, and I had applied for this funding. And we are kind of interested in doing this kind of work with collective memory. And one way we are bringing in opinions, as Sam says, opinions on subjects or texts to be reconstructed. We are actually just going back to community members. We hope to, in the course of this project, to say, how do you want this Black Lives Matter march in Starkville to be remembered, so that we are not just the ones who are shaping that memorial project, but we are going to the community and saying, what do you want to remember? What do you want to get out of this project? And that kind of goes back to what we were saying about community engaged work and making sure that, peer review does not just kind of involve scholars, right? It actually involves broader members of the community who have different kinds of knowledge that they bring to the table and whose opinions and perspectives are really important to consider, especially if it's a project to do with collective memory. And there's some really interesting projects that do this. The Baltimore Stand Up project, I think. There's the Stand project itself, which documents student activism. And there's some really interesting projects out there that kind of have taken up this charge to document activism and how we want to collectively remember what's going on around us at the moment. So I think for me, it would be, going back to the community and really allowing the community to share from the beginning how they want the project to move forward, and making sure that they have a chance to review the final material before it gets posted.
I think, oh, go ahead, Nicole.
Sorry, I was just going to add that I think of silences in this regard, so that digital humanities techniques can help us identify outliers, or again, if we critically read something or distant read something, we can see where those silences are, or archival gaps. So in some cases, it's not so much that we're able to reconstruct the public memory, but in some ways revise it in a way to acknowledge that there's a predominant voice that's being remembered or not.
I think you know what I'm about to say, Nicole, but the Starkville Civil Rights Project was about kind of untold stories. I don't know about silences, but stories that weren't in the main narrative, because we were comparing ourselves, at least in the very beginning, to the story that everybody knew, which was when the National Guard had to come to the Lyceum in Oxford because they wouldn't let the campus be integrated. But the way that it happened at State was that he just registered for classes, and that was the story. And nobody really knew what he experienced, the violence that didn't happen in the news, but that happened internally for him. So yes, I think the public memory of civil rights in Mississippi is, you know, very violent. It's very dramatic, and I think it ought to be. It was, but it happened in lots of different ways, and that was something that we tried to add to that narrative. Lots of good links are being shared in the chat right now to other projects. Thank you all for your contributions and for your questions. If you have other questions, we are people who like to talk about things. So you have our Twitter handles here. And this is being recorded and will be posted to the website that is linked at the bottom of the page. Thank you all so much for coming. To the panelists, thank you for preparing for this and for taking your time to talk to our campus about what you've done and what it meant to you. And thank you for people who are not from our campus for coming, and people who are for coming as well. I hope this was informative and that it starts conversations elsewhere as well. So with that, I will